in 2000, I think the year 2000 to 2001, I spent a lot of time in this building, and this is the first time that I was able to have lunch before the speaker spoke, because we used to wait for the meetings to start, and then we'd all converge on the food outside. So this is the first time I actually got to eat first. I think the political scientists who are in the room will recognize the very complicated paradigm that I'm going to use today, which is called the Goldilocks phenomenon. And for those of you who aren't less than 6 years old or aren't a political scientist, let me explain what the Goldilocks phenomenon is. It's a little girl who wanders into a cave, and she finds 3 settings of porridge, and one setting is too hot, one setting is too cold, and one setting is just right. And she goes to look for a bed, and she finds 3 beds. One bed is too hard, one bed is too soft, and one bed is just right. And that, I think, is a good way to approach the whole issue of the Taiwan Relations Act after 40 years. Because political scientists, policymakers, historians, politicians, the major debate among them is has the Taiwan Relations Act been too much? Has the Taiwan Relations Act been too little? Or has the Taiwan Relations Act been just enough? And then the question is, of course, too little, too much, just enough for what? And the for what is as a tool of American policy in the Taiwan Straits. Because that's the obvious focus of the Taiwan Relations Act. And the question that I would like to talk about is whether it has in fact served American interests, because my perspective as an American is from the view of American interests. Has it served American interests in the sense that it has been just right for maintaining American interests in Asia, or has it been too little, or has it been too much? So that's what I'd like to do. Has it been a formulation that has served American national interest? And what I'd like to do today is to address that question by taking 3 steps. First, I'd like to talk about the origins of the TRA. And there the question is trying to understand what the interests or the intent of the framers were when they drafted the TRA, and talk a little bit about its substance. So the intent of the framers and what they eventually drafted. Second thing that I'd like to talk about is the role that it's played since 1979 as really the core, the central part of the American One China policy. And finally, what I'd like to do is conclude with the Goldilocks issue. As we look at the origins, as we look at the shape that it took, as we look at the way that it's been implemented, the third question is, has it served American interests? Do we need something else, or do we need something less? So those are the 3 things. Let me talk first about the origins. The Taiwan Relations Act was shaped decisively by 2 factors in 1979. The first factor was the outcome of the Carter negotiations for normalization. The results of the negotiations that took up most of 1978 on American recognition of China. The second thing that I'd like to argue also shaped the TRA is the domestic political environment at the time. So first with the negotiations. Remember, it was 6 years since Nixon's famous dramatic trip. and still there had been no diplomatic relations. Nixon and Kissinger had assured the Chinese that they would recognize China in the second term. As we all know, Nixon had no second term. Ford came to the presidency challenged by the conservative wing of the Republican Party, and also challenged by sort of a mood of malaise in the country over the way the Vietnam War had turned out. And it was not a time to make concessions to the Chinese. So Ford basically, with Kissinger's advice, treaded water, hoping that he would address the normalization issue in his second term. Well, he had no second term. So Carter came to the presidency, and by 1978, he and Brzezinski had made up their minds that there would be normalization with China, and the negotiation process began. The positions, as the negotiation worked its way out, the positions of each side became very clear. China would agree to normalization only under three conditions. The first condition was that diplomatic relations with the Republic of China be ended by the United States, and that the People's Republic of China be recognized as the sole legitimate government of China. Now that term, keep that in mind, would be recognized as the sole legitimate government of China. That was the first Chinese demand. The second Chinese demand was that the U.S. ROC military treaty, the 1959 Mutual Defense Treaty, that treaty be ended. The third demand of the Chinese was that Taiwan be recognized as a part of China. Now that's something that you have to elaborate on, because with the Korean War, we know that during the war, the Cairo Declaration, Potsdam, the surrender documents, all said that Taiwan would return to China. But with the Korean War and President Truman's decision to put the 7th Fleet in the Taiwan area, what is often forgotten is that President Truman also said that the status of Taiwan would be unresolved and would be settled only either by the United Nations or with a peace treaty with Japan. So the war, the American position since the summer of 1950 had been that the ownership of Taiwan, who Taiwan belongs to, is an unresolved issue. And that was one of the first things that Zhou Enlai said to Nixon. He said, "We don't like to hear the term unresolved." Nixon said, "Well, those are the PR people. I'll make sure that it's never said again." It's still American policy, by the way, but we'll get to that. It was said again. So those were the three parts of the Chinese position. The American position was, firstly, that it be allowed to maintain informal economic and cultural relations with the people of Taiwan. Secondly, that it would continue to sell arms to Taiwan. And thirdly, that China would renounce force as a solution to the Taiwan issue. That China would commit to peaceful resolution. In the final agreement, China got two of its demands. China got the demand that it was recognized as the sole legitimate government of China. It also got the demand that the Mutual Defense Treaty would be allowed to expire. That was something the Carter administration insisted on. They would not terminate the treaty they would, by the terms of the treaty, give a year's notice that it would expire. So some face would be saved then. But most importantly, the Carter administration, and this was under the personal instructions of the president, the Carter administration did not recognize that Taiwan was a part of China. In the documents, you'll see that the American statement in the Shanghai Communique, in the 1979 relations, and in 1982 with the arms agreement, the United States acknowledges the Chinese position. We acknowledge, we take note of, we don't recognize it. Now, what the Chinese did in the first instance, the Chinese was Renshidao. And Renshidao is to recognize. When it came to normalization, the Chinese translated acknowledge as Chengren. And that gets very close to recognize. So there is that difference. The Chinese, if you're a Chinese student and you've read the Taiwan Relation and you've read the normalization documents, you'd think that the United States, Chengren, that Taiwan was a part of China. But we did not. There was no agreement. And the United States, so the Chinese got 2 out of 3. Think of it that way. The United States got 1 out of 3. It got an agreement that it could maintain cultural and economic relations with Taiwan on an unofficial basis. What it did not get was a unilateral statement. What it did not get was a statement from the Chinese that they would seek to have a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. The Chinese position then, and still is, that the Taiwan issue is an internal question and that it will be solved in a manner appropriate and chosen by the Chinese government. And it will not exclude that possibility of using force. Secondly, the Chinese would not accept the American demand that arms sales continue to be carried out with Taiwan. And they explicitly made that statement. They explicitly said that this is an issue that has to be negotiated at some point in the future, and we do not accept it. If you're bored one day and have nothing else to do, you should read the diplomatic record of the very last stages of the negotiation, because there's a real bollocks there on the arms sale issue. And Deng Xiaoping, at the very last moment, was furious about arms sales, and he claimed that it hadn't been clearly stated to him, and he was so anxious to get recognition because the Central Committee plenum was coming up, where he was going to announce reform, and of course he was about to go to war with Vietnam, so he needed recognition. But if you read the dialogue between him and Leonard Woodcock, you'll see that neither side really understood clearly what the other side was saying until the very end, when push came to shove about arms sales. But there was no agreement, and the Chinese specifically and publicly said there was no agreement. So what the Americans did was the Americans simply unilaterally made 2 statements. They said that we expect that this issue will be solved peacefully, and that we will maintain full commercial relations with the people of Taiwan including the sale of arms. So it was a very incomplete agreement. It was an agreement in 1979 that left a whole series of items unresolved. And people frequently say that the results of recognition was an agreement to disagree. And that's simply not true. The Chinese didn't agree to disagree, and we didn't agree to disagree. We just simply disagreed. We could not settle those issues. What was the domestic political environment like? Well, the domestic political environment actually was one that was favorable to American recognition of the People's Republic of China. But there were goodly numbers that showed that there was a concern about the fate of the Republic of China. The Republic of China was the old ally, World War II, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the brave Chinese, etc., etc. And there was a constituency in the country that very much saw breaking relations with this old friend, old ally, as an act of treason by the U.S. government. And more importantly, there were members of Congress who felt that way, who felt very strongly, Barry Goldwater, of course, was in the lead, felt very strongly that relations should not be broken with Taiwan. And in his heart of hearts, he probably believed that relations should not be established with the People's Republic of China. The point is that as the negotiations went on, there was concern in Congress about what would happen. And in June of 1978, in the middle of the negotiations, the Senate passed a resolution, 94 to nothing, that any changes in the Mutual Defense Treaty should be submitted to the Congress. And as you probably know, eventually Barry Goldwater brought a suit to that extent, but lost. But the point is that in the summer of 1978, as the negotiations were being carried on, the Senate made clear that it wanted to be consulted. Brzezinski and Carter was as insistent as anyone, kept the negotiations strictly secret. And in Christmas of 1978, while the Congress was in recess, by only notifying a few of the committee people, Carter announced that we were recognizing the People's Republic of China, that we would de-recognize, if that's a word, the Republic of China, and Congress was furious. He had consulted at the very last minute with a few leaders, but that was it. Congress was away from Washington. And a coalition, really, of two groups in Congress formed. On the conservative side, there were the people who felt that relations with Taiwan should be maintained. That's the Goldwater group. But on the liberal side, and there it's Ted Kennedy, Jacob Javits, on the liberal side, there was a belief that relations with the mainland should be maintained, but that it was politically unwise to cut Taiwan off cold, which is how they interpreted the recognition terms. And so there was this coalition. Some groups were ready to maintain a relationship with Taiwan that would scuttle recognition. They didn't care. They didn't like recognition. And there was another group that wanted to preserve recognition, but wanted to preserve it with some consideration of Taiwan. And running through both groups was a feeling that Congress had been insulted, that it was time for Congress to assert itself. Congress had been pushed around during the Vietnam War. They had just passed the Presidential Powers Act, and Taiwan was not going to be a sucker again. So it was in that environment that the Carter administration presented to Congress a very bland, vanilla bill that just talked, it was called the Taiwan Omnibus Bill, that talked only about the instrumentalities of how relations with Taiwan would be maintained after recognition. What was not there was anything about security, anything about the American commitment, any kind of commitment to Taiwan, except the statement that the Carter administration had made that arms would be sold. So Congress was really driven then in legislating for the Taiwan Relations Act. It was driven by two instincts or two factors. One was to make very clear Congress's importance as a policy-making body in the United States, that Congress would assert its authority in this way, reassert its authority. And secondly, this sort of odd coalition of senators, some of whom wanted to maintain relations with the mainland but secure some favorable conditions for Taiwan, others for whom favorable conditions was most important, and they really couldn't give a damn about where the relationship with the mainland went. So what was eventually cobbled together then was a document, was a bill, the Taiwan Relations Act, that was intended to provide some maintenance, continued maintenance of relations with Taiwan, but on the other hand, hopefully not scuttle the recognition with the mainland. Now, I don't want to go on too long about the actual specifics of the Taiwan Relations Act, and I think I won't put it up. I'll just say a couple of things. The Taiwan Relations Act has three parts. One is the Statement of Intentions. And the Statement of Intentions basically says that Taiwan, that the Western Pacific is an area of interest, of American interest. It doesn't say Taiwan is an area. It says the Western Pacific is an area of interest, American national interest. It says that any attempts to intimidate Taiwan by boycotts, by use of threats, will be viewed with grave concern by the United States. Now, some of the more conservatives wanted Taiwan to be in the American interest. It made the usual unilateral statement that the United States expected that China would solve the Taiwan issue by peaceful means. So that was the beginning. Those are the statements of intent. It's an area that we consider important. We will view with great concern any attempts by China to intimidate, boycott, invade Taiwan. And thirdly, we expect that they will resolve this issue peacefully. The next section of the Taiwan Relations Act has to do with policies. It sets up an institution, the American Institute in Taiwan, a private foundation that would represent the United States interests on Taiwan, and the exact wording that was used was with the people of Taiwan, because the government had ceased to exist far as the United States was concerned. So that would maintain economic and cultural relations with the people. There are a whole bunch of stipulations about how people would be put on leave, private foundation, very unofficial. Secondly, it stipulates that Taiwan within the American courts and American law will be considered equivalent to a foreign country. So all of the treaties, all of the laws related to Taiwan continue to be related to Taiwan. The last part, the one that we're concerned with, is the security part. First, arms sales. It was stipulated that the United States would make available, that's the quote, make available arms of a defensive character. Secondly, that the decision on arms sales would be decided by both the President and Congress. That was Congress sticking in its oar again. But a couple of clever people, I think it was Kennedy, inserted the phrase that arms sales would be decided by the President and Congress in conformity with law. And in conformity with law meant that the President didn't have to consult Congress. Thirdly, as far as action, and this is the final part and the punchline part, that if there was a crisis, if there was, I forget what the exact word was, that the President shall consult with Congress as to what action to take in response to any incident in Taiwan. So that's not only did it stipulate the sale of defensive arms, but it also stipulated a possibility that the President, in consultation with the Congress, could actually intervene in a clash between the mainland and Taiwan. Finally, the third part is the role of Congress, and there's a whole section about how Congress shall be reported to, consulted, yearly reports, et cetera, et cetera. Again, the watchdog role of Congress. But fundamentally, what Taiwan got was a legislative security statement by the Congress of the United States, signed by the President, that stipulates the sale of defensive arms and presents the possibility that the President, in consultation with the Congress, could in fact intervene if that decision was made. Now, again, it gets to the War Powers Act, but the Congress stipulated that possibility. It's not automatic. It's not NATO. Even the 1955 treaty was not NATO. Was not automatic. The 1955 treaty talked about mutual defense, but that each of the two sides, Taiwan and the United States, would make their decision in accordance with constitutional procedures. So the United States could do nothing under the Mutual Defense Treaty, and under this Taiwan Relations Act, the United States can do nothing if that's what the President and Congress decide. So that was the recognition process, and that was the final, if you will, American statement on the recognition process. And I think that what becomes very clear is that recognition was, as I said before, made on a very weak basis, with considerable disagreement, with considerable unsettled issues. That's often ignored because of this similarity in the policies that the United States and China eventually took out of recognition and have evolved over the last 40 years. That is the One China policy of the United States and the One China Principle of China. They sound the same. They're enormously different. And the sounding the same gives the illusion that there was some agreement at recognition. The enormous difference, if you focus in on it, highlights for you how different, in fact, each of our two nations approach recognition. So let me just talk a little bit about that. The PRC's One China Principle is very simple. It's that Taiwan, historically, and according to wartime agreements, is agreed to be a part of China. And that their victory, the People's Republic of China's victory in the Civil War, established them, and after all, the United States recognized them as the sole legitimate government of China, established them as the sole legitimate government, and therefore the right to exercise sovereignty over Taiwan. It's that simple, and that's the One China policy. Taiwan is a part of China. It's an internal question. Any attempts to intervene in the Taiwan issue is intervening in the domestic politics of China, and that's it. That's the One China policy, One China Principle. 政策，一个中国政策。No, all right, the 一个中国政策, which is the One China policy, is of the United States, is very different. The One China policy of the United States is simply that we recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole legitimate government of China. Now, back in the 50s, John Foster Dulles used to talk about two Chinas, one China, one Taiwan. That is out as far as the American government's One China policy, 一个中国政策, which is different from 一个中国原则, which is the One China Principle. Now, as far as Taiwan is concerned, remember, we just take note of the mainland position that Taiwan is a part of China. We don't recognize that Taiwan is a part of China or has become, by history or wartime agreements, a part of China. Its status is still unresolved. So where does that put Taiwan? And here's the big hole. Where this puts Taiwan, it's easy for the mainland. Normalization, as far as they're concerned, puts Taiwan, Yuanzi, the 一个中国原则, puts Taiwan as a part of China, a domestic issue which they'll solve as they wish. For the United States, it's much different, because with the passage of the Taiwan Relations Act, following the recognition of the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China, what we did, if you think about it, what we did is we agreed to a relationship and a possible security relationship with a government that didn't exist anymore, as far as the United States was concerned, on an island whose status was unresolved. Because that's basically what the Taiwan Relations Act did. It creates a phantom government. We don't recognize the Republic of China. We don't recognize its existence as a sovereign state. The TRA has made a relationship with the people of Taiwan, and as far as the United States is concerned, the status of Taiwan is still unresolved. So the Taiwan the Taiwan Relations Act created this state-to-state relations, or a quasi-state-to-state relationship with a government, just to repeat, that as far as American policy was concerned, doesn't exist. On an island where American policy is concerned, the status of which is unresolved. But the one area where the United States and China agree is that point, oddly enough. The one agreement that came out of normalization was a negative agreement, and that is that Taiwan was not a sovereign state. The Republic of China was not a sovereign state in the international state system. We've agreed to that. The Chinese have agreed to that. And of course, it's part of Clinton's 3 no's, and it's part of the basic American litany about Taiwan. And yet, alongside that recognition of the non-existence of Taiwan, what you have is the TRA, which is a framework for I would say, a quasi-diplomatic security relationship. And so what you've seen, if you look back at the 40 years, what you've seen is the United States and Taiwan basically developing an ever-expanding informal relationship in terms of trade, in terms of military cooperation, in terms of economic, trade and economics, military cooperation, cultural exchanges, representation. We've just built a new AIT there. It's a dynamic, growing relationship between the United States and Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act. Except with all the support that the United States gives to Taiwan, the one area that it has to be restrained is the area of suggesting in any way that Taiwan is a sovereign state. And so if you notice, for example, on the issue of participation by Taiwan in international organizations, the United States takes a very conservative view, and it basically says that meaningful participation, that there should be an occasion for meaningful participation by Taiwan in international organizations, not membership, because membership would be a deal breaker as far as relations with China is concerned. That's the very bright red line that exists in the TRA. We must stand by the agreement that we made with recognition that the People's Republic of China is the sole government of China, and that the Republic of China, as again restated by President Clinton, that the Republic of China is not entitled to membership in organizations that require statehood. That would be a deal breaker with the Chinese. So with that red line, and you know, we've pushed that red line. I often argue that, you know, with the Taiwan Relations Act, to use another political science term, the United States really had its cake and ate it too. we were able really to, over the 40 years, expand this relationship unilaterally, by the way. We have no agreements with the Chinese that relate to the URA. Unilaterally, we've just made statements and made policies that have expanded the TRA, I think, far beyond what was the original intent. But there are red lines. One of the red lines is, for example, when a congressperson says we should recognize Taiwan, diplomatic recognition. That's a red line. That's not to be done. There are certain implicit red lines that have to do with military cooperation. We can talk about that. But the point is that what many people in Taiwan who are seeking statehood and seeking independence, what they don't seem to realize is that as far as U.S.-China relations, would be very dangerous, would be clearly crossing a red line. So to finish, we come back to assessing the Taiwan Relations Act in terms of American national interest. American national interest is, one, to stand by Taiwan, not because Taiwan is so valuable, but because Taiwan is a symbol of American commitment to Asia. And to abandon Taiwan would not have a favorable impact on Japan or on Korea. So one, to stand by Taiwan. That's clearly the American interest. Secondly, to have stable and peaceful cross straits. I forgot to say that part of the TRA was that the American military be prepared to intervene in the Western Pacific, should that be necessary. That has given PACCOM and Hawaii all kinds of stuff to do. The third part of American interest is good relations with China. We've got to live with China, and we've got to work with China in spite of the vice president. So those three aspects of the American interest, if you then stack that up against the Taiwan Relations Act, I would say it's not too little, because Taiwan has benefited enormously, and we've benefited well from the relationship, economically, politically. It shouldn't be too much, because if it's too much, then the American position in East Asia becomes wonky, to use another political science term. So it's just enough. It's just enough. It's allowed the United States to make its presence and its policy clear. It's also, thus far, allowed the United States to secure these three goals. But again, that red line has to be guarded, has to be carefully watched. Well, I'll talk about the red line well, let me give another example. The recent El Salvador business, when the administration intervened by making the statement that the Chinese were endangering status quo in the Taiwan Straits by seducing Taiwan's allies in South America away from Taiwan. Those allies, those 17 allies that are left, recognize Taiwan, or the Republic of China on Taiwan, as the government of China. Now, we have agreed that the People's Republic of China is the sole government of China. So by somehow associating the derecognition under mainland prompting of Taiwan upsets the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, we're basically saying that we view favorably a policy that recognizes the Republic of China on Taiwan as the government of all of China. And we specifically denied that. And in our, the one thing we agreed on would have denied that. Anyway, I've just something to think about. Well, thank you.
Go ahead and let you call on questioners.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Me?
Sure.
Okay.
First of all, I'd like
Could you identify yourself?
Oh,
sir?
John J. from the Taiwanese community. You put the organization is Love of Taiwan Association. I really like your speech, and it's excellent and point out the OneChina policy, OneChina Principle. And to answer your question, is too much or too little? I think I had a different conclusion like yours. It's too much on the United States, it's too little to Taiwan. Why? Back into 1934, the U.S. Congress passed the Taiwan-Madawi Act for Philippines. It's similar to the Taiwan Relations Act. But the major difference is that in the Taiwan-Madawi Act, they clearly point out the Congress will allow the people of Philippines to become independent within 10 years. But we don't see anything for the Taiwan Relations Act. However, the Taiwan Relations Act did point out in the Section 15, say, the United States de-recognize Republic of China and only recognize the governing authority on Taiwan, which is clear. Unfortunately, today in the international community, always mixed up that Taiwan is Republic of China. And as you point out, in the South America, the 17 countries who have recognized Republic of China, they took Taiwan as all thing, which is not.
Do you have a question, John?
I had a question, of course. I do have a question.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we get.
Of course, yeah. And one point I would like to point out is that you mentioned to the Cairo Declaration actually has a clear answer in the San Francisco Peace Treaty on the Section 10. They clearly said that Japan only give up, recall all the right in China back into 1901.
John, if I could, we have students here.
Okay, yeah.
So
My
just be fair to
my
everyone.
question to you, very simple. On your position, do you recognize, or how do you make a distinguish of the Taiwan and Republic of China? That's my simple question.
Well, let's break that question down. The DPP position, and then I'll give you my position. The Kuomintang position is that the Republic of China, which is now on Taiwan, has been an independent sovereign state since 1920.